3 student federations in Quebec, including my association, ASSÉ, l'Association pour une solidarité syndicale étudiante. And we transformed ASSÉ into a coalition for the duration of our strike last year. And we were founded on principles of free education for all, principles of anti-globalization, principles of feminism. We now gather 35 associations all across Quebec. And we inherited 40 years of syndicalist tradition. When the Liberal government announced this tuition increase 3 years ago, we knew what to do. We followed a roadmap. Democracy is really the central aspect of this. We need to involve not only the people who will agree with us on principle, but disagree with strategy. We need to involve droves, hundreds of thousands, into having a say beyond simply putting a piece of paper in a ballot box every 4 years in order to protest policies. And this is not easy. It requires courage to build bridges between us, the people who attend vaguely socialist conferences, the people who read Jacobin magazine, anti-capitalists, anarchists, socialists, and the people we need to convince in those campuses. Now, the nature of a Quebec Student Association is that every student enrolled in a department, in a faculty, in a college, is by law a fee-paying member of a student association. Now, we had established that our argument against this tuition increase was deeply rooted in a particular neoliberal transformation, which we call the corporatization, the commodification of higher education. And we spent 2 years painstakingly linking our opposition to the tuition hike to a broader alternative project for education and more largely for society. And it's very telling. When it came time to make concessions, finally, 2 months, 3 months into the strike, it gave us broader access to loans. It gave us broader access to credit, right? And this gives you an idea of how far to the right the political discourse in Quebec, in the United States, has shifted when it comes to education. To think that in sub-circles, lowering the interest levels on loans is deemed a radical proposal. It's amazing. It's straight out of Kafka. And as activists, I think we should work outside of that narrow perspective. What started as a small movement of 25,000 students had grown to a march of 200,000 people on March 22nd. It had gone through several rounds of failed, dishonest negotiations with our government. It had gone through nightly demonstrations on a daily basis. It had gone through rounds of direct action, people blocking banks, bridges, causing millions and millions of dollars in economic damage. And this is the language, finally, that our government listened to. It criminalized dissent by enacting Bill 78, which forbid demonstrations and picket lines on campuses. And that turned out to be a fairly bad idea for the government. There was a generalized outcry. My organization, CLASS, decided to disobey to Bill 78 in spite of the very enormous fines. And on May 22nd, 200,000 people took to the streets again to defend their democratic rights. But this time, students were a minority in the march. These were people, the kids, grandmothers, grandfathers, marching together. And at 8 p.m. sharp, for weeks on end afterwards, Quebec was awakened by the sounds of pots and pans, casserole marches. No matter what will happen with that, the Maple Spring will linger on. It will linger on in many areas. It will linger on in the neighborhood assemblies of Montreal, in the discussions of Cooper Union occupiers right now, courageously occupying the offices of the Cooper Union president against the introduction of tuition fees. It will continue to linger on the lapels of Czech and British American students struggling against reforms to higher education.
This trend of increasing tuition has affected all types of schools. So at both public and private four-year colleges, the average tuition nearly tripled from 1980 to 2010, and at community colleges, it more than doubled. So during this period, enrollment in four-year colleges amongst academically qualified students that were low income dropped from 54% in 1992 to 40% in 2004. Other ones that you see that are not as highlighted as tuition battles, many fights are more localized and not as highlighted at the national level. And some of those come from like community colleges where wait lists are now increasing and classes are being cut in half. You also see that at many other universities where they are cutting programs, especially in areas that aren't seen as profitable, and that's typically women's studies, ethnic studies, languages. So some states have turned to privatization of universities because they claim that privatizing will actually lower tuition, save money, and keep universities focused on job preparation. But privatization means, the state's not going to be subsidizing the cost of education anymore, so that actually makes it more expensive. And funding would be coming from private donors through like the Alumni Association or the Endowment Fund, or even outside companies rather than from the state or from the public. So the university is then controlled by private interests rather than the taxpayers or the students or the faculty that the university is actually serving. Increasingly, colleges have been more corporatized and harnessed for private gain. And you can see this in changes in faculty from full-time tenure-track professors to part-time, low-paid, and insecure faculty. More money is being spent on administration and advertising, especially to out-of-state students that would be paying more to go to an out-of-state college. And administration costs have also been rising. So administrators are now being paid more like corporate managers, and if trends continue, the Department of Education estimates that by 2014 there will be more administrators at American four-year nonprofit colleges than there are instructors. And the problem with this, obviously, is that the instructors are the ones that are actually giving students the education they need. Further privatization actually targets students of color specifically. African Americans and Latinos comprise 28% of all undergraduates, but they make up nearly half of the undergraduates in the for-profit sector, which are schools like DeVry or the University of Phoenix. And close to 50% of all delinquent student loans, meaning they've not been paid for a year, are those financing for-profit education. And students at for-profit colleges are actually twice as likely as any other student to default on their student loans. I think it's really important, especially for organizations working around this, is calling for something like free public higher education and making that an incredibly important part of the education you do around student debt and tuition hikes. Because it's not your individual fault that we had an economic crisis. It's not an individual's fault of the structural problems of the system that we live under. So it should not be your individual responsibility to pay back vast amounts of student loans that you were forced to take out because it is required for you now to have a college degree.
So I wasn't paying my student loans, and one day I got a call and they said, "You've defaulted." I said, "What can I do?" And they said, "Nothing, we're adding 19% to your principal overnight." So it was like $15,000 just added, And I was like, that is fucked up. And it was that must have been 2007, and there was no talking about student debt as a disciplinary tool or just as a system rigged against us. I had no idea that bankruptcy laws had been rewritten in 2005 so that I could go and spend $50,000 on credit cards and declare bankruptcy, but I couldn't get out of my graduate school, my terminal master's debt. It was the first or second day of Occupy Wall Street, and these young people had brought these large rolls of paper, and they were standing there like carnival barkers and saying, "Step right up and write down what you are worth to the 1%. Step right up." And I sort of shamefully walked by them, peeked as other people were walking up, writing their names, writing their debt, and to whom they owed it. And it was a very powerful moment for me because I was carrying this $44,000, and there are these people who are 25 years old, they just look like they're beginning their lives, and they're $120,000 in debt, older people with underwater mortgages or healthcare bills. And I thought, okay, something's happening here. People are waking up. Strike debt is an offshoot of Occupy Wall Street, and it first started percolating in May of last year in a series of open assemblies that were hosted by Occupy Theory in Washington Square Park, and they were kind of like the early assemblies at Tompkins Square Park that Occupy Wall Street emerged out of. People were just getting together and brainstorming. And so I went to one that was about ecology. People batting around, okay, well, we organize around that. Well, one day there was an assembly on debt, and it was just like a fire was lit. People were coming forward and telling their stories, and there was an energy in the space that had not been there for any other topic. After the Debt Resisters Operations Manual, we launched something called the Rolling Jubilee, which was a campaign of strike debt. And basically, the Rolling Jubilee, we called it a bailout, the 99% by the 99%. And it's a kind of hack into the secondary debt market. Again, a kind of attempt to do some public education. Few people realize that their debts are actually for sale on a secondary market, and it's really unregulated, it's shadowy, and it's basically, they're merchants of misery. You can go online and buy up a bunch of payday loans or somebody's medical bills, and then you own them. We're not able to buy all kinds of debt. We can only buy debt that is unsecuritized, and so basically, but we can buy medical debt. So the initial concept was that we were going to try to raise $50,000, which would buy about $1 million of medical debt, and that we would do a big public education campaign. And we launched with a telethon at Le Poisson Rouge in November of 2000 of last year, as kind of a star-studded, by our standards, lowly star-studded telethon. But the project actually didn't need the telethon. It went viral, and we ended up raising $600,000, which we will have abolished about $12 or $13 million worth of people's medical debt. Our point was never that this idea would scale, because there are trillions of dollars of debt sloshing around the system, but that it would open an imaginative space. One thing about the debt crisis we're all in is over the last 30 years, wages have stagnated, unemployment has grown, right? We've covered this up with credit. That's, this is part of why we've been able to stay afloat, but it's kind of crumbling down. That has coincided with the sort of demise of the traditional labor movement. So could debtors' unions be another way of organizing people? Often people share a creditor with different types of debt. You'll owe your credit card debt and maybe you even put your healthcare bills on your credit card. You'll owe your student loans and your mortgage to JP Morgan. There are different types of debt owed to these creditors. And could that be a way of organizing people?
Do you have relationships with people who are in your equivalent of high school? Because I know it's not the exact same. But how do you get them when they're young? Is there? But so I just wanted to know a little bit more about the structure.
I have actually 3 steps. After primary school, you have high school that lasts a year less. And then you have 2 years of college that are mandatory and free, what we call cégeps. And they give both technical degrees and also pre-university degrees. So they're not really, they're mandatory in the sense that they're mandatory to go through if you want to go to university afterwards. And then you have 3 years of a bachelor's degree. And we organize in these colleges as well as in universities. In fact, most of our membership comes from colleges. And so people already go through a radical student union and that experience of demonstrating and being immersed in a culture of direct democracy and a critique of higher education before arriving to university.
I love the high school idea. I mean, again, I guess this idea of being 17 and that they're like army recruiters. I think an anti-recruitment campaign is really cool. And I do think alumni have to go back to the colleges. Again, this issue, you're 21, you think you're going to graduate, you're going to get that job you always wanted. Alumni need to go back to their schools in an organized fashion and talk to people who are enrolling. And you get opportunities. I mean, my grad department invites me to their cocktail every year, and I go, oh my God, I would never go to that. But maybe I should. Maybe I should go and tell people not to enroll. So I think there's a role for organizing alumni and doing and they have a kind of moral authority, because you graduate, you're indebted, and the school calls you up, a week later asking you for money.